Welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Damien.
I'm Aaron. Thank you for joining us today.
For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work of social justice.
That's what we do here, yeah.
That's right.
Each week we're going to bring something new to the table, discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
That's right. We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, that's you.
Yep.
You're up this week. What have you brought to the table today?
Well, as you'll recall from last week, I'm bringing the whole Supreme Court, so we can just yell at them right here. So come on in.
Bring 'em
Alito, Roberts. The other one who doesn't talk, Thomas. Thomas, come on in. Gorsuch.
Wow.
Kavanaugh.
Oh, man.
We don't need to talk to all of them, just the six.
Yeah, really just those. Did you get Coney Barrett?
Oh, yeah, I forgot about it. Yeah.
Wow. That would be
they're in the green room. If you could go get them. No, I reached out to their clerks and they didn't respond for comments.
I'm so shocked.
Yeah.
What did you bring instead then?
I brought a New York Times interactive piece from their website called "The Major Supreme Court Decisions in 2023," which, as you can tell by the title, lays out the decisions from the court over the course of this year.
Yes.
And it gives a very brief synopsis of each one with links to additional reporting and some public opinion polling on the subject of each case, which I thought was interesting.
I love that.
I think we'll probably talk about it throughout the conversation. The piece outlines 12 different cases that have been decided on this year. Most of them I feel like we haven't really heard about. They haven't made the news as much as others. So like one is tech companies not being able to be sued for terrorist groups posting content on social media platforms. Another one is about animal cruelty regulations being able to be enforced across state lines, which had something to do with California. The way that pork is raised and the consumption of pork products and that being regulated in California.
Right.
And then there are the big ones that are really recent about affirmative action, the EPA regulations, student loans, LGBTQ plus rights. So there's a lot in here, and I guess we should mention that we're not lawyers or constitutional scholars or anything. We're just, two relatively intelligent people who, as our podcast description says, are angry. We're just going to talk about it, and we're going to talk about, mostly not the actual law of it, but just sort of what the impact of it might be on us, on the people, regular everyday people.
Yes.
So that's what I have brought forth to the table.
You did. That's what I'm prepared to talk about today.
Oh, good.
Not a crossfire interview with the Supreme Court justices. That would have been
all right. Bring them in.
Bring them in. I was like, wow. No, this was a very interesting piece from the New York Times. I think I appreciated getting to take this sort of broad look at their last 12 months and all the things that they've ruled on, but also particularly, as you mentioned, this public opinion about these issues. And they did it in such a fascinating way to me. They presented the data using bar charts for each of the issues and cases. And I just thought that was a really great way to showcase this data in sort of a clear and digestible way.
Yeah.
And what it was a representative sample of Americans who were surveyed by an organization called YouGov and sort of got a sense of how they felt about these issues in comparison to how the Supreme Court ruled on them. So, I thought it was great. Broadly, I sort of think this was a great piece because there's a lot to take away from it, right? I think as we continue to think about and talk about all of the issues that we talk about on this show, right? But I think especially the role that our elected officials play in our daily lives and in our continued pursuit of what we talk about here, social justice, collective liberation, especially when those elected officials are responsible for the appointments of federal judges and Supreme Court justices, right?
With lifetime appointments.
So this is a very big deal, right? And so the work we do to educate ourselves and organize around candidates who share our values and beliefs, and candidates who pursue initiatives and laws and policies that align with what we truly need for our collective liberation, I think is so important, right? And that importance, I think, is made so clear when you look at all of the work, or much of the work, that the Supreme Court has done this past year.
Yeah. I think it's crucial to understand how the court operates and how the justices come to be justices.
Yes.
And, maybe it's a good time now to point out that the Republicans have actively gerrymandered voting maps in their favor for a long time. So they are overrepresented in the House and Senate when you compare that to the number of voters who support or are registered Republican. So that means they've tipped the scales to be able to appoint and confirm judges that they approve of and make decisions to block justices who they don't approve of.
That's right.
And I said justices, but judges on all levels of the federal courts.
Yep.
All these decisions from the court this year are also tainted by years of manipulation and rule bending from Republicans. This has been a long-term strategy of theirs to change the arc of the court, change change who's on the court, composition. That's what I was trying to say. Change the composition of the court.
Yep.
And they were able to do it with good old Donnie.
Yes. And now, these decisions that they have made are long-lasting, right, and far-reaching.
Yep.
As a result of all of that. So,
and that was the point.
That was the point.
Time.
You're right.
And aside from all of that, I did want to mention it just to sort of, hammer it home. I want to talk about the student debt relief case,
yes,
which was denied on the basis that the Biden administration wanted to provide some forgiveness to borrowers based on the HEROES Act, which was a COVID relief bill that did a lot of stuff, including those stimulus checks that a lot of us got a few years back.
Yeah.
So basically, the court says that the Biden administration can't hand out student debt relief based on the HEROES Act because it wasn't in the law. Which is ultimately fine because the administration has the authority to delay payments, as they have been delayed since April 2020 or so, whenever that happened.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Or cancel debt entirely through the Higher Education Act of 1965, which they have been doing for certain groups over the last several years, including groups that have been essentially scammed by for-profit institutions.
Right.
And they just announced another wave of forgiveness to the tune of, I want to say like $40 billion. I didn't write that down.
Yeah.
For people who have been making payments based on their income and participating in those programs.
Right.
Because those programs have not been, payments haven't been tracked appropriately for those.
Wild.
And the deal was that they would get forgiven after a certain number of payments, after a certain number of years.
Right.
And a lot of that hasn't happened for folks. And so they're revisiting that and sort of forgiving that debt for those people who have been sort of screwed over by the way that the system has worked so far.
Absolutely.
But I want to say this Supreme Court decision isn't a full defeat of student debt cancellation. It's merely another redirection, and hopefully it's one back toward the authority that the administration already has, because they are using it in some ways, and they can use it more broadly.
Right.
As far as we know, and what the good folks over at the Debt Collective have said through their action, that debt can be forgiven through this act that the administration already has the authority to do that with. So
it's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out, right?
And how they respond.
And where we go from here. But that's a really good point, that it's not a full defeat yet, right? And so sort of now we'll see what happens. But you're right. That sort of is a great segue from what you started to talk about, and just this idea of, right, it's been years of this in the making in Republican strategy to get us to where we are. And now we've got this sort of onslaught of decisions that we have to sort of reckon with, right? And that can potentially have catastrophic, right, impacts on real people, right? Real people dealing in this case with student debt, right? Or one of the cases that was really so fascinating to me, and I was excited to learn more about it, right? Was the Supreme Court's ruling that the Clean Water Act does not allow the EPA to regulate discharges of pollutants into wetlands near bodies of water, what the case would have referred to as, quote, navigable waters, right? And so with that decision, the Supreme Court severely limited the power of the EPA to regulate the health and well-being of our country's wetlands and waterways.
Yeah.
Right? So that's sort of one piece of this. The decision could potentially impact the future of water quality in the country as well, right?
No way.
Yeah, right. And our ability to sort of control waterways in times of climate change and climate crises in the future, right? And as we are in this incredible heat wave with all of all the things that are happening on our planet, this is huge, right? And I think there's a lot more nuance and it's issues in the case, right? So that's sort of broad stroke, but I think what was so striking to me is when I think about the connections that exist between a decision like this one to social justice and collective liberation, right? And to what we talk about here on the podcast, from everything I read, even beyond this piece, this New York Times piece, this case and decision sits at a unique intersection, right, of public safety, climate change, social and environmental justice, right, and the idea that this is the one and only planet we have, right, and we have to share, and so the potential impact of this decision on water quality, as I mentioned, is something that could very well be a game changer for all of us, right, and that makes me think about who in this country has access to resources that might protect them better, or at least for longer, than communities and people in this country who don't, right? I think certain communities could potentially bear the brunt of this decision more than others, right? And so this one was just a fascinating case just to learn more about and understand sort of the reach of the EPA, right, and sort of what the Supreme Court has done to sort of handcuff them a little bit, and what the potential sort of long-term health impact of a decision like that could be.
Yeah, and there's a ton in that decision, I think. I mean, one, just on the surface, like it's, I don't know, outlandish to me to think that the wetlands that aren't directly connected to a waterway or to a water source wouldn't seep toxins and pollutants into that water source, right? Like,
right.
Because in a lot of ways, those wetlands are there to absorb like stormwater.
Yep.
And then the stormwater overflows into the river, to the lake, whatever it is.
That's correct.
And so then the pollutants, like they travel in the water. So I don't know. It just seems, it feels like common sense that the court's like, well, yeah, maybe it is, but the Clean Water Act doesn't actually say this.
It feels like common sense, but it also feels like it's backed by real science, right?
Yeah.
There is evidence, right? That is what science is based off of, right? There is evidence of what these waterways and what these bodies of water do. But sure, throw it out.
So that, I mean, it's wild in that way. Continuing to strip the EPA of its ability to regulate or enforce environmental laws is also actually pretty unpopular, according to the Times public polling graphic.
That's right.
Which said that 72% of people believe that the Clean Water Act should be read broadly to include things like wetlands. And so that 72% of people was an amalgamation of different people on the political spectrum.
Yes.
So that was 81% of Democrats agreed. 70% of independents agreed, and 66% of Republicans agreed.
Right.
That is a supermajority across the board.
Across the board.
That
right?
means it is wildly popular, right? Like there's name another thing that like 81% of Democrats and 66% of Republicans would agree upon.
Right.
I don't know that I could come up with anything right now. And it demonstrates how out of touch the conservative justices of this court are, and how, maybe their interests aren't vested in like all of us
Yes.
in the long term.
Absolutely.
So, that's just something to think about. Like, not all of the cases lined up in that way where the court made a decision that would be considered wildly unpopular. Some of it was very like right down the middle.
Yes.
In terms of the public opinion polling. And some of it, like the court ruled in favor of like sort of what the public thinks. And that doesn't mean that the court should always rule in favor of what the public thinks.
No.
Either, right? Like,
right.
But, I think when we're considering like, our only natural planet and environment, there's I don't know. There's something that this whole decision just seems ridiculous to me.
100%. Yeah.
But I also wanted to talk briefly about the LGBTQ case, which was about the woman in Colorado who argued that she has a First Amendment right to deny service to a gay couple if they wanted to make a wedding website. Which I believe she had never done a wedding website at all for anybody. So that's interesting. And there are a lot of other issues like that being reported about the actual merits of the case. It's possible that some of the information from the initial request for a wedding website was falsified. It seems odd to me that a case that already has a lot of fallout associated with it in terms of it being directed at queer folks, like businesses have gone on social media across the country and been like, well, I guess I don't have to serve you anymore. And I don't know that this case actually is that far reaching, right? Like in terms of its decision, it's I don't know that it's that broad.
Right.
So it's fun that they just get to show their true colors, right? And we get to believe them, as I believe James Baldwin told us to do.
Yeah. Yes.
So but it's wild to think that it might be based. The whole thing might be, house of cards, like, and based on false information. And it's hard to believe that it could go this far without some real credible concerns about the establishing factors of the case, the establishing facts of the case.
Absolutely. I mean, it's wild to me that that's the case, and it's wild to me that made its way to the Supreme Court, right? Like there are lots of sort of legal scholars and legal experts who talked about how this case shouldn't have even made its way to the Supreme Court, right? As a result of all of that, right? With sort of false information at the jump. So, but here we are.
Because some of the lower courts, I think, said that, hey, not all of this adds up. Like, what's going on here?
But then here we are. Yeah.
Here we are.
And I think that's such a great connection that you make to, what is the impact, right, of a decision like this, right, with other businesses now saying, well, the Supreme Court said, that's a difficult thing for us to now reckon with, right? And I think we're going to continue to see in certain places the impact of a decision like that one on real people. Yeah. So that one's a really difficult one. The other one that I'll briefly mention was on affirmative action. I think, obviously given our day jobs, but also in general, it's just a big deal. The Supreme Court decided that the use of race as a factor in college admission review processes violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Sure, right. And I just worry about this decision and what it will mean for future students who are from communities that have historically faced incredible obstacles in their educational journeys and beyond their educational journeys, right? I know that there will be plenty of colleges and universities that will do all that they can to figure out a way to continue their commitments to enrolling diverse student bodies. So that's great, right? But I'm really concerned about those other colleges and universities and what they might do now that this Supreme Court decision has happened, right? For me personally, I work in scholarship administration now, and so this decision also makes me worry about the effects of this decision and what it might mean beyond the admission review processes at institutions as well, right? And so how students are awarded financial aid or scholarships, how those decisions are made. So there's sort of broad ripple effects of this decision that I know colleges and universities are going to have to grapple with for some time. So it's going to be interesting to see, like with many of these decisions, how they play out in the coming months.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's this is another one that is bizarre to me because it's like the ruling on the Voting Rights Act from several years ago that essentially said, well, yeah, there were some problems in the past, but those problems are fixed. And so we don't need to closely regulate the voting in these states that have historically,
Disenfranchised.
purposefully disenfranchised black people at the polls. Look, we fixed it.
Yeah.
We don't need to watch them anymore because they're not doing those things anymore. And then they just started doing those things a little bit differently as soon as they were allowed to.
Absolutely.
And this feels kind of like that, where it's ignoring the ways that schools are funded differently based on the neighborhoods that they're in, how segregated we all still are from each other in reality, and then the way that segregation still plays a huge role in the value of homes, which then plays a huge role in the funding of our school systems.
Yes.
And when you put all those things together, it's like, well, how can then, if the K-12 system sets up sort of racial disparities, even there, like taking out all the other sort of experience, because we're just talking about education, that alone merits the use of race as a sort of deciding factor in terms of admission into college.
Absolutely.
Because the whole system up to that, like, race has played a factor in people's lives.
Yes. It's all connected.
Yeah.
Everything is connected, right? In these systems.
So, it's just another like head scratcher. And I think, again, displays how disconnected the justices are from the sort of day-to-day lives of regular people.
Absolutely.
Across the country.
Wow. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's talk about application. How does all this apply to our day-to-day lives? I mean, a lot of these decisions are going to impact us for a long time.
Yeah.
And it's hard to fathom ways that it will impact us now, because I don't know, some of the ways that we can't imagine what those ways will be yet. Right. It's going to continue to, I'll say, devolve.
I was going to say devolve. Yes.
So, but one of the things I wanted to talk about is we've always been told that the court isn't a political entity, right? That it's somehow above it all. I think these decisions this year add evidence stacking against the court that it does indeed have an agenda. Striking down affirmative action and ruling in favor of so-called religious freedom, which really just means giving some religions preferential treatment over others to make decisions on who they can discriminate against because it's quote unquote part of their religion.
Right.
That's what's happening. Restricting the EPA's ability to regulate wetlands and pollution. It all seems to be in favor of corporations and the dominant forms of thinking of white supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy and imperialism that have ruled our country since its founding. And it's just sort of reifying those things again when it felt like sort of slowly we were stepping away from those being the overt things, right? And then these rulings come out a few weeks ago or whatever, and it's like, oh, no, these are still the overt, right? Like, it's pulling the wool from our eyes some.
Yes.
Just to reiterate that, like, no, we're still doing the white supremacy. We're still doing all of these things. And just they're just saying it out loud.
Yes.
In ways that I think we had stopped saying it out loud. I don't know. Yeah, I could go off on another tangent about things. So that's my application, is that the court is a political entity, and we can stop believing the nonsense that it's not.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the evidence is clear, and you're right. I think these decisions only sort of add fuel to the fire, right? And sort of reignite, catapult, these issues, right? White supremacy and the like, right? Back into the limelight, right?
Yeah.
Back into sort of full focus, right? And what that will do for people who are all impacted by those systems, right? What that will do across the board for all of us is really sort of troublesome, I think. So that's application for sure. I think how I was thinking about application was the fact that I think for a long time and for a lot of people, the Supreme Court has often felt like this high court that's distanced from us regular everyday people, right? But the reality is the Supreme Court has this huge, incredible responsibility and has a direct impact on people's everyday lives, right? These decisions that they get to make have transformative and long-lasting impacts that can literally change the course, I think, of our social and economic and political future as people, right? And as a nation. And so this piece, I think, and sort of thinking about and processing these decisions, I think it only reinforces that it truly matters who our Supreme Court justices are, right? And that means we have to think about and play an active role in our democracy at every opportunity. It's so imperative because otherwise, as you say, right, this court becomes this politicized weapon.
Yeah. And I think that active role in democracy is important. And it's an active role in all the formal ways that we're sort of quote unquote allowed to be participants in our own governing structure, but also all of those unspoken ways that we can be, I guess, disruptive to it, right? Like interrupting in the ways that the wheels of this system chew us all up.
Yes.
And so there's lots of ways to play an active role.
I love that.
Yeah.
Very good.
All right, well, let's talk about homework. How are we going to continue to learn about this beyond our conversation here today? I think for me, I want to learn more about sort of court reform stuff. Whether that's changing the number of justices or instituting more stringent accountability measures, as there's a lot of funny business for gifts that some of these justices have received, or at least the appearance of funny business.
Yes.
A lot of which I think I would be fired for if I did something similar.
Absolutely.
Which is interesting to sit with, right? Like, oh, if I did that, I wouldn't have my job anymore that is much less consequential in terms of the way that the country operates, right?
Absolutely. And people live their lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lifetime appointments also probably need to be revisited. And I think there are some proposals out there for that. So it'd be cool to check that out. And then the other thing is, like, what can us regular folks do in response to these rulings? So that's where my mind goes for homework. For this conversation. What about you?
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking about it's probably time now to sort of revisit some of those articles and resources and work that's been done to think about this idea of packing the court, right? And and just the possibilities that exist beyond what we currently have, right? Because now we're seeing the repercussions of what this court looks like now, right? And what it does. So I was thinking that for sure. I wanted to do some more education around that. I also think there were a few decisions that we didn't really get a chance to talk about, right? And you sort of highlighted some of them at the top, but there were some that I just haven't heard a lot of, right? I was unfamiliar with, really. The liability of tech and social media platforms and posted content that supports terrorism,
right.
And sort of the liability of those platforms aiding and abetting terrorism but not removing content. So that was one. The other, that California one around animal cruelty and the pork. Yeah. Right? These are just cases I hadn't really heard anything about. So I just want to spend some more time reading up on those and figuring out sort of, how they made their way to the Supreme Court, what's at the core of those issues, right? Just because, it's kind of fascinating to me that I hadn't heard of them before this.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting, right? Like reviewing that page, I thought, oh, there's a bunch of stuff that's happened that we just didn't hear about because I guess it wasn't newsworthy too much. But yeah, that's those are also interesting cases to consider and think about. Like, how does this impact us?
Right.
All right. Well, I think that's enough ranting and raving from at least me. I'll say I was for this week. Damien, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode for us to rant and rave about?
I appreciate and always love your ranting and raving.
Oh,
so
thank you.
Keep it coming.
Yeah.
For our next episode, we definitely might do some more ranting and raving because I'm bringing a book to the table for us. Our July book, August book, whenever that episode will come out.
July.
Okay, July. Yeah. And this, because this one certainly has a direct connection to what we've talked about today, right? The Supreme Court's recent ruling on student loan debt. So the book is called Can't Pay, Won't Pay, The Case for Economic Disobedience and Debt Abolition. It was written and produced by our friends at the Debt Collective, which, as folks probably know, is an organization that we've talked about a few times here on the podcast. They are a union of debtors working and fighting to cancel debt in all of its forms and to change the systems and institutions that produce debt, right? And they do that work in a lot of pretty incredible ways. The book also features a foreword that was written by Astra Taylor, right? Which is pretty cool. So I pulled a quote from our friend Kianga Yamada Taylor. Here's what she says about the book. And she starts actually with a quote from the book. So here we go. By prioritizing redress and repair, we can win free and universal education, housing, and healthcare. No one should have to go into debt to meet their basic needs. Debt Collective declares in this urgent book, which lays out concrete strategies and a powerful vision for radical change. So I'm partway through the book. It's been great so far. I'm really excited to finish it and, to get to chat with you about it next time.
Yeah. Yeah. This was a Haymarket free book during the pandemic. They were doing that, I think once a month or once every few months in 2020. And so I read it a few years ago.
Yes.
And there's a lot that I learned about how financial systems have shifted over the course of the last 50, 60 years,
right.
To create the huge amounts of debt that so many of us carry. Not just student debt, but all kinds of debt that we have that would have been unheard of like in the 60s or 70s. So very interesting history of how the financial systems have shifted to give more power to financial institutions and banks and whatnot. So excited to talk about that.
A lot we can learn, and we all can learn, right?
Right.
And then I'm excited to also talk a little bit about like what next, like what now, right? And their sort of wisdom around what we can do armed with this information. So
right.
Yeah.
And if talking about financial systems and banks doesn't sound exciting to you, that's okay. What's exciting about it is not the banks themselves, but it's about how all these systems are finding ways to screw us over.
Yes.
And so that's what we're actually going to talk about with the book,
100%.
because that's what the book talks about.
Yes. All right. I can't wait.
Yeah, me either. All right. So with that, we want to thank you for joining us today and for listening to Interdependent Study. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share a podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media. Check us out on YouTube. We have a Threads account if you want to follow that.
That's right.
Sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we got going on behind the scenes.
I love it. Yes. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. And we'll talk to you next week.